A new Maritime Incident File has surfaced. If you appreciate these types of mermaid stories, take a short break to like and subscribe. Either way, enjoy.
Harold Brennan would remember every detail of what he saw inside that trap for the rest of his life. The pale hand gripping the wire mesh from the inside, the fingers too long, webbed to the second knuckle, ending in curved claws that had already torn through 3 of the trap's steel reinforcement bars. And the eye that found him through the gap black as crude oil, lidless, reflecting nothing of the gray morning light. In 42 years of hauling traps from these waters, Harold had pulled up every manner of strange thing the Atlantic cared to offer. Unexploded ordnance from the Second World War, a sealed coffee can containing $14,000 in cash, the partial remains of men he'd known personally. But nothing had prepared him for what waited inside trap number 37 on the morning of October 19, 1994. His son Danny would later tell investigators that his father's screams didn't sound human, that the thing in the trap had screamed back, that when Harold finally got the trap door open with his bare hands, losing 3 fingers in the process, the creature inside had looked at them both with something worse than hunger. It had looked at them with recognition. But to understand what the Brennans encountered that morning in Frenchman Bay, we need to go back to the night before, when Harold made a decision that would change everything. The Jennifer Marie was a 38-foot wooden-hulled lobster boat that Harold Brennan had built with his own hands over the course of 3 winters in the late 1970s. She was nothing fancy, a traditional Maine design with a low wheelhouse, a hydraulic trap hauler mounted on the starboard rail, and enough deck space to stack 200 wire traps if you knew what you were doing. Harold knew what he was doing. He had been lobstering these waters since he was 14 years old, first as a sternman on his uncle's boat, then as captain of his own vessel for more than 3 decades. He knew every ledge and shoal between Bar Harbor and Winter Harbor, knew where the lobsters crawled in spring and where they retreated when the water turned cold, knew the moods of Frenchman Bay the way other men knew the moods of their wives. His son Danny was 26 that autumn, recently returned from 4 years in the Coast Guard, with a wife and baby daughter waiting at home. The plan had always been for Danny to take over the Jennifer Marie when Harold's joints finally gave out, and that October they were working the boat together for the first time since Danny was a teenager. The lobster season had been poor that year. The old-timers blamed it on the water temperature, which had been running 2 degrees warmer than usual since August. Some of the younger fishermen talked about pollution from the cruise ships that had started making regular stops in Bar Harbor, dumping God knows what into the bay when no one was watching. Harold didn't much care about the reasons. He cared about the fact that his traps were coming up light, that his fuel costs were eating into what little profit remained, and that the mortgage on his house was 3 months overdue. He needed a big haul, and he needed it soon. That's why, on the evening of October 18th, Harold made a decision that went against 40 years of accumulated wisdom. He decided to set traps in the deep water off Egg Rock, in the channel where the bay floor dropped away to nearly 300 feet. Most lobstermen avoided that water. The old-timers said the bottom was wrong down there, too soft in some places, too hard in others, with currents that could drag a trap half a mile overnight. Harold's own father had warned him about that channel when Harold was still young enough to listen. There's things down in that deep water that don't like being disturbed, the old man had said, though he'd never elaborated on what those things might be. Harold had dismissed it as superstition, the kind of story fishermen told to keep competitors away from productive ground. But as he guided the Jennifer Marie out of Bar Harbor that evening, watching the sun sink behind Cadillac Mountain, he felt a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with the cigarettes he'd been smoking for 30 years. The evening was uncommonly still as they motored past the breakwater and into open water. Danny stood at the stern, organizing the bait barrels, while Harold kept his eyes on the depth finder mounted above the helm. The numbers climbed steadily as they left the harbor behind 40 feet, 60 feet, 90 feet, and Harold noticed that the usual chatter on the VHF radio had gone quiet. He switched through the channels, hearing only static where there should have been fishermen complaining about the weather or their wives or the price of diesel. It was as if every boat in the bay had decided to stay home that night. The air temperature dropped as they entered the channel, and Harold could see his breath fogging in front of the instrument lights. Danny came forward, rubbing his hands together, and asked if his father had checked the marine forecast. Harold hadn't. He'd been in too much of a hurry to get the traps in the water before dark. Now, looking at the flat, calm surface of the bay and the stars beginning to appear in the eastern sky, he told himself there was nothing to worry about. The weather was fine. The boat was sound. They would set the traps, mark the positions, and be back at the dock in time for a late supper. What Harold didn't notice, what neither of them noticed, was the way the fish finder had gone silent the moment they entered the deep channel. No baitfish. No bottom dwellers. Nothing but empty water all the way down to the seafloor, as if everything that lived in this part of the bay had decided to be somewhere else that night. They had set 43 traps and were preparing to drop the 44th when Danny called out from the stern. His voice had an edge to it that made Harold cut the throttle and step out of the wheelhouse. Danny was standing at the rail, looking down at something in the water. The deck lights cast a yellow circle on the surface, and within that circle Harold could see the trap line running down into the darkness. But the line wasn't hanging straight. It was moving, not drifting with the current, not swaying with the motion of the boat, but moving with purpose, jerking and twitching as if something far below was testing its strength. Probably a seal, Danny said, but he didn't sound convinced. Harold had seen seals play with trap lines before, and this wasn't that. This was something pulling from straight down, something with enough strength to make a heavy nylon line hum with tension. "Cut it loose," Harold said, and the words were out of his mouth before he'd consciously decided to speak them. Danny looked at him with surprise. Harold Brennan had never cut a trap loose in his life. Not for weather, not for tangled lines, not for anything, but something in his father's face made him reach for the knife on his belt. Before he could touch it, the line went slack. Whatever had been pulling from below had let go. Father and son stood at the rail for a long moment, watching the line drift in the current, neither willing to speak first. Finally, Harold turned back toward the wheelhouse. "We'll haul that one first thing tomorrow," he said. "See what's been bothering it." It was a reasonable statement, spoken in a reasonable tone, but both men knew they were lying to themselves. Both men knew something was wrong. The radar showed no other vessels within 10 miles. The VHF remained silent, despite Harold's attempts to raise the Coast Guard station at Southwest Harbor. Even the engine seemed quieter than usual, as if the Jennifer Marie herself was trying not to attract attention. They finished setting the last of their traps in near total silence, working by the glow of the deck lights while the stars wheeled overhead. When the final trap splashed into the black water, Danny asked if they should head back to the harbor. There was no shame in the question. Any sensible man would have done exactly that. But Harold Brennan had never been accused of being sensible, and he had a superstitious dread of leaving a job half-finished. "We'll anchor up in the lee of Egg Rock," he said. "Get a few hours' sleep and start hauling at first light." It was a decision that would cost him 3 fingers, 2 years of nightmares, and every certainty he had ever had about the world he lived in. But standing there on the deck of his boat, with the October stars bright overhead and the sea as calm as a mill pond, Harold could not have known what was waiting for them in the deep water below. He could not have known that something had followed them since they entered the channel, something that had been watching them set their traps one by one with the patient attention of a hunter studying its prey, something that was even now rising toward the surface, drawn by the lights of the Jennifer Marie and the promise of what those lights might mean. They would not have to wait until morning to find out what they had disturbed. The scratching began at 0347. Harold was asleep in the wheelhouse, slumped in the captain's chair with his jacket pulled over his shoulders, when the sound brought him bolt upright. It was a rhythmic scraping noise, like fingernails drawn across a chalkboard, coming from somewhere below the waterline. Danny was awake too, sitting up on the bunk in the folk's lee, his face pale in the glow of the instrument lights. "Probably just the anchor chain," he said. "Dragging on rock." Harold didn't answer. He was listening to the sound, trying to place it. The anchor chain would make a different noise, heavier, more metallic, with a grinding undertone as the links scraped across stone. This sound was lighter, almost delicate, like something testing the hull, searching for a way in. He reached for the spotlight mounted beside the helm and switched it on, playing the beam across the water surrounding the boat. The surface was still glass calm, reflecting the stars like scattered diamonds, and for a moment Harold allowed himself to believe that Danny was right, that it was just the anchor chain, or a piece of driftwood bumping against the hull, or any of the 100 innocent explanations a lifetime at sea had taught him to accept. Then the spotlight found the water off the port bow, and Harold's heart stopped in his chest. There was something floating there, just at the edge of the light, a shape that was almost human, with pale shoulders and dark hair spreading across the surface like spilled ink. Harold held the spotlight steady, unwilling to believe what his eyes were telling him, and the shape turned toward him. He saw a face, a woman's face, or something wearing the memory of a woman's face, with cheekbones too sharp and a mouth too wide and eyes that caught the spotlight and threw it back as flat black circles. The face was watching him, studying him, and then, slowly, deliberately, it smiled. The smile revealed teeth rows of teeth, needle-thin and slightly curved, far too many to fit in any human mouth. Harold heard himself cry out, heard Danny scrambling up from the fogus sly, heard his own voice screaming at his son to get away from the windows, get away from the rail, don't look at the water. When he turned the spotlight back to where the face had been, there was nothing but smooth black water. No ripples. No disturbance. As if whatever he'd seen had never been there at all, or had sunk straight down without displacing so much as a single drop. Danny was beside him now, demanding to know what was happening, what Harold had seen, why he was shouting like a madman in the middle of the night. Harold opened his mouth to answer, and the scratching sound came again louder this time, more insistent, running the full length of the hull from bow to stern. Then, from somewhere beneath their feet, they heard something that would haunt them both until the day they died. A voice, singing. The words were in no language Harold had ever heard, but the melody was unmistakable. It was a lullaby. The same lullaby his mother had sung to him when he was a child. The same one his wife had sung to Danny. The same one that Danny's wife now sang to their infant daughter. It was coming from below the boat, rising up through the hull, and it was the most beautiful and terrible sound Harold Brennan had ever heard. Danny's face had gone slack, his eyes unfocused, and he took a step toward the rail. Harold grabbed his son by the shoulder and hauled him back, breaking whatever spell the singing had cast. "Don't listen to it," he said. "Don't look at the water." "It sounds like Sarah," Danny whispered. "It sounds exactly like Sarah." The singing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, and when it finally stopped, the silence that followed was somehow worse. Harold kept his son close, kept his eyes fixed on the instrument panel, and began to pray for dawn. The first gray light of morning found them still awake, still pressed against the far wall of the wheelhouse, still listening for sounds that never came. The scratching had stopped around 0500. The singing had not returned after that first terrible performance. As the sun rose over the Camden Hills to the east, turning the water from black to gray to silver, Harold almost allowed himself to believe they had imagined the whole thing, that the stress of a bad season and the strangeness of the deep channel had combined to produce some kind of shared hallucination. "We should pull anchor," Danny said. "Head back to the harbor." He was right. Any reasonable man would have done exactly that, would have left the traps to rot in the deep water and never returned to this channel again. But Harold Brennan had 187 traps in the water, each one representing a $40 investment he couldn't afford to lose. And more than that, more than the money, more than the pride, he needed to know what he had seen. He needed to prove to himself that it had been real. "We haul the traps," he said. "We haul them and we get out." The hydraulic trap hauler hummed to life, and Harold began the work that had defined his entire adult life. Find the buoy, hook the line, feed it through the hauler, wait for the trap to break the surface, check the catch, rebait, reset, move on to the next one. The first 36 traps came up with respectable catches, not great, but enough to justify the risk of setting them in deep water. Harold began to relax, falling into the rhythm of the work, telling himself that whatever had happened in the night was over now. The sun was up. The radio was working again. They could hear other boats in the distance, their engines thrumming as they worked their own trap lines. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. Then Danny hooked trap number 37, and the hauler groaned with a strain it had never shown before. Harold looked at the hydraulic pressure gauge and saw the needle climbing into the red. Whatever was in that trap, it weighed 3 times what a full catch should weigh. "Cut it loose," Danny said, echoing his father's words from the night before. But Harold was beyond reason now, driven by a need to understand that overrode every instinct screaming at him to flee. He increased the power to the hauler, watching the heavy nylon line inch upward through the gray water, and waited. The trap broke the surface with a sound like a gunshot. Water exploded outward in all directions, and Harold saw for just an instant the shape of something massive thrashing inside the wire mesh. Then the trap swung inward, crashing against the rail, and he saw what they had caught. It was impossible. It was real. It was watching him with eyes like pools of black oil, and it was very, very angry. The creature filled the trap the way a body fills a coffin press against every surface, contorted into a shape that should have been impossible for anything with a spine. Harold's first impression was of pale flesh, corpse-white and glistening with seawater, stretched over a frame that was almost human. His second impression was of teeth, rows of them, needle-thin and slightly translucent, filling a mouth that had opened too wide and was still opening wider. The creature's hands, webbed to the second knuckle, tipped with claws the color of old bone, were gripping the wire mesh from the inside, and 3 of the trap's steel reinforcement bars had already been torn away. Harold could see the curve, what should have been legs, but was instead a single powerful tail, covered in scales that shifted from silver to gray as the light struck them. The tail was coiled against the far end of the trap, and the ragged fins at its end were slashing back and forth with enough force to make the entire trap shudder. But it was the face that held him, the face that would wake him screaming for years to come. It was a woman's face, or had been once high cheekbones, a pointed chin, features that might have been beautiful before something terrible had happened to them. The skin was too tight now, pulled across the skull like wet paper, and the eyes were wrong in every way a pair of eyes could be wrong. Too large, too dark, lidless and unblinking, fixed on Harold with an intensity that made his bladder let go. The creature opened its mouth, that impossible mouth, far too wide for the face that contained it, and it screamed. The sound was nothing like the singing from the night before. This was rage-given voice, a shriek that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and drive straight into the brain. Harold felt blood trickle from his nose, felt his vision blur at the edges, felt his legs begin to buckle. Beside him, Danny had fallen to his knees, both hands pressed against his ears, his own screaming lost in the cacophony. Then the creature stopped. The silence that followed was so sudden and so complete that Harold thought for a moment he had gone deaf. He watched the creature shift inside the trap, watched it press one clawed hand against the wire mesh directly in front of his face, watched its black eyes move from him to Danny and back again. It was thinking. Harold could see intelligence in those terrible eyes, cold intelligence. Ancient intelligence? The intelligence of something that had been hunting in these waters since before humans had learned to build boats. The creature shifted again, and Harold noticed something he had missed in his initial shock. There were marks on its body, old scars, long-heeled, running in parallel lines across the gray scales of its tail. Net marks, he realized. Something had caught this creature before. Something had held it, perhaps studied it, and then, what, released it? Escaped by it? The scars told a story Harold couldn't read, but the ending was clear enough. The creature had survived. It had learned. And now it was applying that hard-won knowledge to the situation at hand. The black eyes moved to the trapdoor, examining the mechanism with an attention that made Harold's blood run cold. This was not a mindless animal reacting on instinct. This was a predator with experience, with memory, with the capacity to learn from its mistakes. And it had made a decision. The creature withdrew its hand from the mesh and turned its attention to the trapdoor, the spring-loaded hatch through which lobsters entered and from which they could not escape. The door was designed to hold against any pressure from the inside. That was the whole point of a lobster trap. But it had not been designed to hold against claws that could tear through steel. Harold watched, paralyzed, as the creature began to work at the door mechanism. It took the thing less than 10 seconds to figure out how the latch operated. It took another 5 seconds to begin bending the hinges. Harold watched, transfixed, as the creature's claws found the weak points in the metal and began to apply pressure. The steel groaned. The creature's face showed no strain, no effort, just that terrible calm focus. Those black eyes fixed on the problem in front of them. Behind him, Harold heard Danny praying. The Lord's Prayer stumbled through in a voice that cracked on every other word. Harold hadn't heard his son pray since childhood, hadn't thought Danny believed in anything anymore. But here in the presence of the impossible, old habits were surfacing like wreckage from a sunken ship. The trapdoor buckled. One hinge tore free with a screech of tortured metal, and the creature paused, tilting its head as if considering the sound. Then it reached through the gap it had created and began to work on the remaining hinge. "Help me," Harold heard himself say. His hands were moving toward the trap door, toward the creature, toward certain death. "We have to let it go." Danny stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. Perhaps he had, but somewhere in the fog of terror that had descended over Harold Brennan's brain, a single clear thought had emerged. The only way they survived this was if they gave the creature what it wanted. The creature wanted out. Harold reached for the trap door. The creature watched him come, its black eyes tracking his movements with predatory precision. When his hands touched the metal, he felt a vibration running through the trappo, low hum that seemed to resonate in his chest. The creature was making a sound, a subsonic rumble that he felt rather than heard, and he understood with sudden horrible clarity that it was communicating. It was telling him something, warning him perhaps, or promising him something. The trapdoor latch was a simple mechanism, a bent metal rod that hooked over a loop, holding the door shut against the push of the trap's occupants. Harold had opened 10,000 trapdoors in his lifetime. His hands knew the motion by heart. But as his fingers closed around the latch, the creature moved. One webbed hand shot through the gap in the mesh and seized his wrist with a grip like a hydraulic vice. Harold screamed. The pain was beyond anything he had ever experienced. Not just the pressure of the grip, but something else. Something that felt like electricity running up his arm and into his brain. He could feel the creature inside his head, rummaging through his thoughts, examining his memories with the casual curiosity of a child, flipping through a picture book. He saw his wife's face, his son as a baby, the first fish he'd ever caught, the last conversation he'd had with his father before the old man's stroke. Everything that made Harold Brennan who he was, laid bare before this impossible thing. Then the creature released him, and Harold staggered backward, clutching his wrist. The skin where it had touched him was unmarked, but his hand felt wrong, numb and tingling, as if he'd slept on it for hours. The creature gestured toward the trap door with one clawed hand. "Open it," the gesture said. "Open it now." Harold opened it. The creature emerged from the trap with a fluid motion that defied everything he knew about bodies and bones and the limitations of physical form. One moment it was coiled inside the wire mesh. The next it was on the deck of the Jennifer Marie, its tail curled beneath it, its upper body raised like a cobra preparing to strike. It was taller than Harold had expected, or perhaps longer was the better word, easily 8 feet from the crown of its head to the ragged tips of its tail fins. The gray scales that covered its lower body continued upward, forming a pattern across its torso that resembled nothing so much as armor. Or perhaps a rib cage, Harold thought, turned inside out. Water dripped from its body onto the deck, pooling around the coiled tail, and Harold noticed that the wood was darkening wherever the water touched, not just wet, but stained, as if the creature's very essence was corrosive to the things of the surface world. The smell hit him then. Salt and copper and something else, something organic and ancient, like the air in a cave that had been sealed for centuries. It was the smell of the deep places, carried up from 300 feet below, and it made Harold's stomach heave. The creature seemed to notice his discomfort. Its mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it, something that suggested amusement at his weakness. The creature looked at him. Then it looked at Danny, who had not moved from his position on his knees, who was staring at the creature with an expression that mingled terror and something else, something that looked almost like wonder. For a long moment, no one moved. The boat rocked gently in the swell. The morning sun climbed higher, and two species regarded each other across a gulf of evolutionary time that made the distance between them almost incomprehensible. Then, with no warning at all, the creature lunged. Harold threw himself backward, certain he was about to die, certain that those needle teeth were about to tear into his throat. But the creature wasn't aiming for him. It was aiming for the rail. The creature hit the gunwale and went over the side in a single motion, barely disturbing the surface as it entered the water. Harold scrambled to his feet and ran to the rail, staring down at the place where it had disappeared. The water was clear enough that he could see down perhaps 30 feet, and in those 30 feet he saw nothing. No shape descending into the depths. No trail of bubbles. Nothing at all to suggest that a creature from Nightmare had just passed through that space. It was gone. They were alone. Harold turned to help his son to his feet, and that's when he noticed the blood. His right hand was shredded. 3 fingers, the index, middle, and ring, had been stripped to the bone from the second knuckle to the tip. The creature hadn't released his wrist when it grabbed him. It had bitten through his fingers while he was lost in whatever trance it had induced. Harold stared at the ruin of his hand, watched the blood dripping onto the deck of his boat, and began to laugh. He was still laughing when Danny helped him into the wheelhouse, still laughing when his son wrapped the hand in a spare shirt and called for help on the VHF, still laughing when he passed out from blood loss 20 minutes later. The laughter had sounded, Danny would later tell the doctors, like something breaking inside. The Coast Guard cutter arrived within the hour, guided by Danny's coordinates and the urgency in his voice. They found Harold unconscious in the wheelhouse, his hand wrapped in a blood-soaked shirt, his face pale as paper. They found Danny at the helm, steering the Jennifer Marie toward Bar Harbor with the fixed concentration of a man trying very hard not to think about anything at all. They found the trap still sitting on the deck, its door hanging open, its wire mesh torn and bent in ways that the responding petty officer had never seen before. And they found the scratches. Long parallel gouges running the entire length of the hull, from the bow to the stern and back again, as if something had circled the boat multiple times while dragging its claws across the wood. The investigation that followed was brief and inconclusive. The Coast Guard classified it as an equipment accident, the standard finding for injuries sustained during fishing operations. The trap damage was attributed to possible marine mammal interaction, a catch-all category that covered everything from curious seals to aggressive whales. No one asked why a marine mammal would circle a boat for hours in the middle of the night. No one asked what kind of animal could tear through steel reinforcement bars with its bare hands. No one asked because no one wanted to know the answer. The petty officer photographed the scratches, measured them, made notes in his incident report. He had seen boat damage before: scrapes from dock pilings, gouges from submerged rocks, the distinctive marks left by propeller strikes. This was none of those things. These scratches had been made by something with claws. Something with claws approximately 3 inches long, spaced roughly 2 inches apart, with a reach that suggested an arm span of at least 6 feet. No known marine animal matched those dimensions. No known marine animal could have made marks that deep in solid wood while the boat was underway. The petty officer filed his report and forgot about it within a month. Just another strange detail in a career full of strange details. But the photographs remained. They're still in the Coast Guard's archives today, if you know where to look. A marine biologist from the University of Maine examined the trap 2 weeks after the incident. Her report, never published, noted several anomalies that she could not explain. The metal of the reinforcement bars had not simply been bent. It had been corroded at the stress points, weakened by some chemical agent before being torn apart. Tissue samples recovered from the wire mesh contained DNA that matched no known species in any database. And the pattern of damage to the trapdoor suggested not random animal behavior, but systematic problem-solving, a methodical approach to escape that implied cognitive capabilities far beyond anything documented in marine mammals. The biologist requested funding for a follow-up expedition to the deep channel. Her request was denied. 6 months later, she left the university for a position at a private research firm. She has never spoken publicly about her findings. Harold Brennan spent 3 weeks in the hospital in Bangor, undergoing 2 surgeries to save what remained of his hand. The doctors were puzzled by the wound pattern. The flesh had been removed with surgical precision, they said, almost as if something had peeled the skin and muscle away, layer by layer, rather than simply biting through. They were more puzzled by the infection that set in on the 3rd day, an infection that responded to no known antibiotic and seemed to recede only when the wound was exposed to direct sunlight. Harold never spoke to the doctors about what had happened. He told them he'd caught his hand in the trap hauler, a plausible accident that the doctors accepted without question. Lobstermen lost fingers to trap haulers every year. It was almost a rite of passage in the industry. But to his wife, late at night when the pain medication had worn off and the hospital room felt like a cell, Harold told the truth. He told her about the singing, about the face in the water, about the creature in the trap and the feeling of it inside his head, examining his memories like files in a cabinet. His wife listened without interrupting, and when he was finished, she asked him a single question. "What did it show you?" Harold didn't understand. "You said it was in your head," his wife said. "You said it looked at your memories, but you had your eyes open the whole time. You must have seen its memories too." Harold closed his eyes and tried to remember. The pain and terror had scrambled his recollection of those few seconds. But now, in the quiet of the hospital room, images began to surface. Dark water, stone structures rising from the seafloor, not natural formations, but built things, carved things, covered in symbols he couldn't read. The structures stretched for miles. Harold realized, a city on the ocean floor that dwarfed anything human civilization had ever constructed. Towers that rose hundreds of feet from the sediment. Archways that opened onto deeper darkness. And everywhere, the symbols spiraling patterns that seemed to move when he looked at them, that seemed to burrow into his brain and make a home there. More of the creatures, dozens of them, hundreds of them, moving through the water with the coordinated purpose of a wolf pack. They were hunting. Harold could feel their hunger, their focused predatory attention, their absolute certainty that whatever they were chasing would not escape. But they were also communicating, singing to each other in frequencies below human hearing, coordinating their movements, sharing information in ways that made dolphin pods look primitive by comparison. This was not a school of animals. This was a society, an ancient, organized, intelligent society that had existed in the deep places of the Atlantic since before humanity had climbed down from the trees. And something else, something larger, something sleeping in the deepest part of the canyon, its bulk casting a shadow across the ocean floor for miles in every direction. Harold could not see it clearly. The creature in the trap had not wanted him to see it clearly, but he could feel its presence. Massive, ancient, patient, waiting for something that Harold desperately hoped would never come. The creature in the trap had shown him its home, its people, its God, and it had shown him, in terms that required no translation, what would happen to anyone who disturbed that sleep. Harold Brennan sold to Jennifer Marie 3 months after his release from the hospital. He sold his house, paid off his debts, and moved inland with his wife to a small town in Vermont where the nearest body of water, larger than a pond, was more than 50 miles away. He never spoke publicly about what happened in Frenchman Bay. He never filed a report with the marine authorities. He never tried to convince anyone that what he'd seen was real. But he did one thing before he left Maine forever. He found the other men, the other fishermen who had ventured into the deep channel over the years, the ones who had come back changed, the ones who wouldn't talk about what they'd seen. There were more of them than he'd expected, far more. A retired captain in Stonington who had lost his entire crew in 1967 and couldn't explain how. The man had been the sole survivor of a 4-man vessel, found drifting 3 days after radio contact was lost, with no memory of what had happened, and scratches covering every surface of his boat. A trap hauler in Jonesport who had found something impossible tangled in his lines in 1978 and had burned his own boat rather than let anyone see it. He still woke screaming 40 years later, still refused to eat fish, still crossed the street rather than walk past the harbor. An old man in Lubeck who claimed to have seen whole colonies of the creatures during a diving expedition in 1952, living in structures that predated any known human civilization. He had photographs blurry, water-damaged, but undeniably showing something that shouldn't exist, and a diving partner who had disappeared during the expedition and whose body was never recovered. A woman in Castine, the widow of a trawler captain, who had found her husband's logbook after his death and discovered entries describing encounters spanning 3 decades, sightings, sounds, disappearances of crew members that had been attributed to accidents, but now took on a more sinister meaning. And dozens more. Fishermen who had heard the singing. Fishermen who had felt something brush against their hulls in the deep water. Fishermen who had pulled traps that came up empty but covered in scratches. Fishermen who had simply vanished, their boats found drifting with no sign of struggle, no explanation, nothing but those same parallel gouges in the wood. These men had kept their secrets for decades, dismissed as drunks or liars or simply touched in the head by too many years on the water. Harold Brennan listened to their stories, recorded them in a notebook, and added his own account to the collection. That notebook exists today. It's kept in a safe deposit box in Burlington, Vermont, with instructions that it should be opened only after Harold's death. Harold Brennan is 81 years old now. He has perhaps a few years left, perhaps less. But before he goes, he wants people to know. He wants people to understand that the ocean is not empty, that the deep places hold things that have been there far longer than humanity, things that do not appreciate being disturbed, that the fishermen who work those waters are not the only hunters out there. Danny Brennan never went back to lobstering. He used his Coast Guard training to find work with the Department of Marine Resources, spending 20 years behind a desk in Augusta, as far from the water as a man could get while still working in the fishing industry. He processed fishing licenses. He reviewed catch reports. He sat in meetings about quotas and regulations and sustainable harvesting practices. And he never once mentioned what he knew to be true about the waters his department was supposedly managing. What could he have said? That there were things in the deep channels that no quota would ever control? That the fishermen who ventured too far from shore were entering territory that had belonged to something else for millennia? That the ocean was not humanity's to manage, but merely to borrow? And that the real owners were patient, but not infinitely so? He doesn't talk about what happened on the Jennifer Marie. His wife knows, she's always known, even though he's never told her directly, but it's not something they discuss. Their daughter, now grown with children of her own, has asked about his missing grandfather's fingers, about why her father never takes her to the beach, about the nightmares that still wake him 3 decades later. Danny changes the subject. Some memories are too heavy to carry in daylight. Some truths are too dangerous to share. But every October, on the anniversary of that morning in Frenchman Bay, Danny Brennan drives to the coast. He parks his car at the overlook above Bar Harbor, where he can see Egg Rock and the deep channel beyond. He sits there until dark, watching the water, remembering. And sometimes, when the light is right and the sea is calm, he thinks he sees something moving out there. A pale shape just below the surface. A flash of silver-gray scales catching the last of the sunset. A face turning toward him from the deep, watching him with eyes that remember everything. The scratches on the hull of the Jennifer Marie were documented by the Coast Guard, but the photographs were never made public. The medical records from Harold Brennan's hospitalization are sealed under patient privacy laws, though his missing fingers are visible in every photograph taken of him since 1994. The notebook containing his research into other encounters remains in the safe deposit box, waiting. But the creatures themselves remain where they have always been, in the deep water, in the dark places where sunlight never reaches. Watching, waiting, remembering every boat that passes overhead, every trap that descends into their territory, every fisherman foolish enough to work the deep channel after dark. The thing that Harold Brennan pulled from Frenchman Bay that October morning was not unique. It was not alone. And according to the old man in Lubeck, it was not even fully grown. The waters off the coast of Maine are some of the most productive fishing grounds in North America. Thousands of boats work those waters every year, hauling millions of pounds of lobster from the rocky bottom. The industry generates hundreds of millions of dollars annually. It employs tens of thousands of people. It feeds families and builds communities and sustains a way of life that has existed in these coastal towns for generations. Most of the boats come back safe. Most of the fishermen never see anything stranger than an unusually large catch or an unexpected storm. Most of them work the shallow waters, the safe waters, the waters where sunlight still reaches the bottom, and the depths are measured in tens of feet rather than hundreds. But some of them venture too deep. Some of them set their traps in the channels and canyons where the old things live. And some of them, like Harold and Danny Brennan, live to tell about it. If you've ever worked the waters of the North Atlantic, if you've ever felt the hair rise on the back of your neck for no reason you could name, if you've ever pulled a trap that felt too heavy and decided not to look inside, we want to hear from you. Leave your story in the comments below. You're not alone. And neither are they. Subscribe to Maritime Incident Files for more accounts from the deep.